Yeah, it dropped every single year from 1989 through 2014, and then has really leveled out for the last 3 hunting seasons. And that is in large part through efforts from QDMA to just teach people the benefit of protecting yearling bucks, both to the deer herd and, to their hunting opportunities. So that more than anything else is what has played into that, 2-decade run of every year shooting fewer and fewer yearlings. Hunters were just having the opportunity to shoot more bucks that were at least 2.5 years old. And boy, as soon as they started doing that, they realized, ooh, this is way better than shooting yearling bucks.
Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast, episode number 250. Kip Adams, The Whitetail Report, 2018 Harvest Trends. Support for the Big Buck Registry and the Deer Hunt Podcast comes from Hunter's Blend Coffee, imported directly from family farms, roasted and brought to you by hunters who support the hunting industry. Polar Works Coolers and the Chill Zone, specializing in the most durable, reliable thermal cups and coolers. Keep your drinks hot or cold in any element. Black Ash Outdoor Products reduce your risk of tree stand suspension trauma with a Tree Stand Wingman, the Tree Stand Emergency Descender System. Covert Scouting Cameras, remote cameras for hunting, wildlife, and security. The Horny Buck Seed Company. It's all about the freshest seed. Morris's Sporting Goods, a full line of sporting goods without the sales tax. And Big Buck merch. You can get cool, high-quality Big Buck t-shirts, long-sleeve t-shirts, and hoodies. And show support for this podcast by visiting www.bigbuckregistry.com/MERCH. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level.
This is Jim Burler from Western Extreme, and you're listening to my favorite Big Buck Registry Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hi, this is Larry Weisson from Trailing the Hunter's Moon, and you're listening to my favorite podcast on iTunes. The Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast.
This is R.G. Bernier of BigWhitetail.com, and you're about to listen to my favorite deer hunting podcast, the Big Buck Registry.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow predators. My name is Jay, and thank you for tuning in to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. For Dusty Phillips and Jim Keller and the entire staff here at the Big Buck Registry, welcome to this week's show. There are a couple things I'd like you to do for us if you could. If you would, please check us out on iTunes, subscribe, and leave us a review. With your help, we're going to try and push this show up the iTunes charts. I know we have a lot of listeners out there, and I need you to take some action. I need you to leave a review and subscribe to the show. If you do subscribe, that'll give you access and notification each and every week that a new show is released. You can also access this show in its entirety on YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and as an Amazon Alexa skill. Go to Alexa and say, Alexa, enable Big Buck Registry. It's all right there for you to access on demand at your fingertips. Regarding the harness program, we have an ample supply of harnesses to give away from our volunteer donors. If you're in need of a full-body harness, please send an email to j@bigbuckregistry.com. Whitetail deer are arguably the most important game species in North America. Kip Adams, wildlife biologist and director of conservation for the Quality Deer Management Association, would agree with this concept. More hunters pursue whitetail than any other species, and whitetail hunters contribute more financially than any other hunter segment. But how do the numbers stack up state to state? Who's killing the most deer? Which state kills the most does? Which state kills the most bucks? Which state kills more bucks per square mile? Which state has the highest percentage of yearling buck kills? Which has the least? We had lots of these types of questions, and it just so happens that the QDMA puts out such a booklet about this each year. So we asked Kip to break it all down for us. We'll turn to our entire interview with Kip Adams in just one moment, but before we do, let's hear from our friends at Polar Works Coolers and Jim Keller with the Deer News. Folks, I want to tell you about one of the best coolers I've found for the price in quite a while. I was with my family the other day, and I couldn't believe the price on the cooler I was looking at. I always wanted one of those high-end coolers because of the quality that I had heard of, but I couldn't justify the price. Then I found Polar Works. Finally, I found a company that understands quality and affordability. The Polar Works lineup is extensive and is filled with Polar cups, Polar tubs, and Polar soft coolers. What do I love about these coolers? Well, for one, the ice stays frozen for a long period of time. But they've thought of other things in their design. For example, drain speed. No one likes a slow drain after a long weekend on the trail. The Polar Lock system. You're always protecting your valuable beverages from thirsty outsiders. And there's the non-slip Polar Feet. Polar Feet will prevent sudden movement when you're on the move. There's the sweat-free material, so you don't have to worry about cleaning up puddles when you're finished with your journey. Polar tubs hold ice for such a long period of time because of the 3-inch insulated walls, the heavy-duty gaskets, and the fail-proof hinges, which guarantee a freezer-tight seal. So check out polarworks.com when you're considering your next high-quality cooler without breaking the bank. That's www.polarwerkz.com.
For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News. Our first story this week, disturbing photos show deer walking with arrows in their bodies in Oregon. This story is from the CBS News website and was reported by Christopher Brito. Oregon State Police released disturbing photos of live deer with arrows embedded in their bodies. In a Facebook post, OSP said troopers responded to calls in Shady Cove last Friday of a deer that had been shot with an arrow which was still stuck in the animal. Upon further information, they discovered up to 3 deer could have arrows protruding from them. OSP provided pictures with a warning that they may be disturbing. The images show 2 deer, one of them with an arrow stuck in its neck and the other with an arrow stuck in its face. According to OSP, while the injuries to the deer don't appear to be life-threatening, it signals a deeper problem for the environment. The Oregon Hunters Organization and local archery shops pledged a total of $2,600 to catch whoever did it. Hunters can now apply for Wisconsin's 2018 inaugural elk hunt. This story is from the Outdoor Hub website. As of Tuesday, May 1st, Wisconsin residents are able to apply for the first ever managed elk hunt in state history, according to the announcement by the state's Department of Natural Resources. The state is issuing a total of 10 tags for a bull-only hunt in fall of 2018. 4 tags will be awarded to Wisconsin residents through a random drawing, and 1 additional tag will be awarded through a raffle conducted by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. This is an incredible conservation success story for Wisconsin, Department of Natural Resources Secretary Dan Meyer said. Thanks to the efforts of so many great organizations and individuals, the northern elk herd has continued to grow to the point where we can offer this very special and long-awaited hunting opportunity. The hunt is set to take place within the Clam Lake Elk Range of Sawyer, Bayfield, Ashland, and Prince counties in northern Wisconsin. Of course, this inaugural elk hunting season will adhere to a few guidelines which are as follows. Season dates will be October 13th to November 11th and December 13th through 21st, 2018. 5 bull-only tags will be issued. Bull elk means any elk with an antler of at least 6 inches in length. Hunting will be allowed only in the Clam Lake Elk Range. Only Wisconsin residents are eligible to apply for and receive an elk hunting license. Hunters must submit an application each year they wish to be entered into the drawing for an elk hunting license. No preference point system is available. A person may be issued or transfer only 1 elk license in their lifetime. Hunters can apply for their tag throughout the month of May. Applications cost $10 with an additional $49 cost for the winners. For more information, check out the department's Facebook Live announcement in March. Data shows 6.1% CWD infection rate in tested Wisconsin deer. This story is from the Star Tribune website. Data from the State Department of Natural Resources shows about 6% of deer tested last year were infected with chronic wasting disease. According to the data, 600 of the 9,882 deer analyzed tested positive for the disease, an infection rate of nearly 6.1%. The 2016 infection rate among tested deer was 7.3%. The 2015 rate was 9.4%, the highest since the disease was discovered in Wisconsin in 2002. The testing runs from April 1st through March 31st. 3 of the 50 deer the DNR has tested since March 31st were infected. Governor Scott Walker announced Wednesday he was directing state agencies to develop regulations requiring enhanced deer farm fencing and limiting movement of dead deer from CWD-affected counties in an effort to slow the disease's spread. Vermont slashes moose hunting permits from 80 to 13. This story is from the Outdoor News website. The Vermont Fish and Wildlife Board has voted to drastically reduce the number of moose hunting permits to 13 this year, down from 80 in 2017. The hunt will also be limited to bull moose in the northeastern corner of the state. Wildlife biologist Cedric Alexander Vermont's moose project leader, estimates the state has 1,650 moose, with the greatest concentration in the Northeast Kingdom. He says the state is restricting the hunt to that area where the moose population is stabilizing. He says research indicates that maintaining a density of 1 moose per square mile will provide fewer hosts for winter ticks that have been infesting moose. World record 13-beard turkey is back from the taxidermist, and it looks incredible. This story is from the Wide Open Spaces website and was reported by Colton Bailey. Tyler Mumpower was 11 years old when he harvested the bird of a lifetime. Not very often do turkey hunters kill a bird with more beards than years they've been alive, but that's exactly what happened to this young man. And not only did this 13-beard turkey set a Pennsylvania state record, it set a world record too. Well, after a year of patiently waiting, the bearded boss is back in Mumpower's hands, and it looks magnificent. The mount brilliantly showcases the 13 beards protruding from the Big Tom's colorful chest feathers. Kudos to Geisinger Taxidermy in Maryland. The record bird from Adams County gained a lot of attention, and Mumpower received an invitation to the 2018 National Wild Turkey Federation show. The 13 beards total 78.9375 inches. The total score is 199.25. It is the third highest scoring gobbler in the NWTF Wild Turkey records. Tyler just recently harvested another bird this spring. You can continue to follow along with his turkey hunting adventures and any news on the record bird at his page, 13 Bearded Turkey Boss. The bird is back at home with Tyler on the wall of his parents' home. That concludes this week's edition of the Big Buck Registry's Deer News. For links to the stories featured this week, please check our show notes at www.bigbuckregistry.com. If you have any ideas for future topics or have any questions about any of these topics, please email me at jim@bigbuckregistry.com. For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News.
Thanks to Jim Keller for the Deer News. Without further ado, here is Kip Adams. Kip Adams, welcome to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're psyched to have you in the studios. What's happening?
Well, it's nice that much of the country is finally getting some nice weather after a long winter, and things are finally getting green. So that's a good thing for me personally and a good thing for deer.
Yeah. Last week I had my winter coat on. This week I'm in shorts.
I know. We actually I live in northern Pennsylvania, and we had snow on Sunday morning, but 80 degrees yesterday. So I prefer somewhere right in the middle between those two at this time of year.
It's crazy, man. It's a bizarre year, but the fall was pretty hot, and then it got pretty elongated winter into the spring, and not that the date. I mean, the dates are the dates, but the temperatures certainly felt a little off.
That is for sure. And actually, I talked to a buddy this morning in Minnesota that said a few more days of good weather, and he thinks the ice is going to be off their lakes. So
all right.
That puts a lot of things into perspective, I guess.
It does. It really does. Well, I appreciate you putting together this QDMA Whitetail report. You guys sent it to me, and I've gone through it, and it's fascinating information for a book nerd stat guy like me. And I'd like to kind of pick your brain and go through what it's all about and find some of those really nitty-gritty, juicy stats and highlights that probably people might not even realize. And this, I appreciate you putting that together.
Absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and jump right in.
Cool. All right. Well, before we do that, tell me a little bit about yourself. How are you related to the QDMA, and where you're from? Where'd you grow up? Where does this passion for whitetail come into play?
Sure. I grew up in north central Pennsylvania. Actually grew up on a dairy farm and into a family of hunters. My dad hunted, and my grandparents hunted, my uncles hunted, my friends hunted, everybody hunted. So it was just the most natural thing in the world for me to want to be in the woods and hunt. And that led to an interest to want to be a wildlife biologist.
Nice.
So followed that path through school, my undergraduate degree at Penn State. Mm-hmm. And then I went to the University of New Hampshire for my graduate degree, and ended up going to Florida. I worked for the state agency in Florida, the state wildlife agency for 4 years. And I really just thought that's it. At that time, if you wanted to be a wildlife biologist, you either worked for a state or a federal agency. So I began my career with the state of Florida, left there, went back to New Hampshire and became New Hampshire Fish and Game's deer and bear biologist for a couple of years. And actually, I was in New Hampshire when I learned about QDMA. Back in 1999, QDMA sent a brochure to every state's lead deer biologist with just some information about the organization and some educational materials they had. And I read it, started learning more about QDMA, became a member immediately, and thought, man, this is perfect. This is exactly what I wanted to do professionally as well, through the state agencies to help teach hunters and make them more knowledgeable. And well, that parlayed into QDMA posted a position for working out of Pennsylvania and covering the Northeast U.S.
Gotcha.
And it was just a dream come true. So I left New Hampshire Fish and Game, came back to Pennsylvania, got that position, and that'll be 16 years ago this summer. So it's been a good ride with QDMA.
That's cool. I'm always fascinated when I read about where you guys are from. We had Matt Ross on the show a little while ago, and Matt, of course, had his master's from the University of New Hampshire. You have a master's from the University of New Hampshire. You work for New Hampshire Fish and Game, and I have a bachelor's from the University of New Hampshire. So there's like this tie that's related to deer management, I guess.
Good deal. That's a great school for sure.
Yep. No, I enjoyed my time there for sure. Let's get into some of the nitty gritty of this. Why did you create this book?
Well, the 2018 edition was our 10th one that we've done. So a little over a decade ago, we were sitting and just talking about some new materials that QDMA could provide to be helpful to hunters and land managers and state wildlife agency folks. And we have always done a bunch of educational materials. That really was what QDMA was founded on, was providing this information to folks to help them be better deer stewards and better habitat managers. And so we really took a bunch of materials that we had and said, we really ought to put these things together and make them available to folks. And then that kind of led into, well, what would be even better is if we did that, plus did a national survey of all the state wildlife agencies, and they put all of the harvest data into one place. And then that led into, man, that would be cool. And if we also, while we were talking to the state wildlife agencies, got information on other things, that would be most helpful. So that's really what it came out of. So the very first one that we did back in 2008, where we put 2009, we put all this stuff together and kind of created, it was a little more heavy on the biology side than they are now. But over the years, we've fine-tuned it based on comments from media and wildlife professionals and hunters and others on what they want in there, what is most helpful to them. So it has not changed a whole lot over the years. So I guess we did a pretty good job starting out hitting a blueprint for something that the folks really wanted. But we make sure that we always include the latest harvest data, and then so that people can take a look at kind of how their state stacks up against other states and what other information other places are collecting. And it's been a lot of fun for sure. And we've received a lot of accolades about it over the years that people are using it. So that's the ultimate compliment. If folks are using it, that's what we want. So we're glad to do it.
Nice. Now, breaking it down, the table of contents, you break it down into deer harvest trends, and then into current issues and trends, and then the QDMA mission and annual reports. Of those items, what are some of the highlights of that you mentioned? Like just in your introduction, you mentioned that the yearling buck harvest rates remain at record low numbers. Can you extrapolate on that a little bit?
Sure. The first part is a lot of fun for hunters to look at because it really shows what's going on in the world of deer hunting. Like what are people shooting in your state and other states, and how does that compare over time? And the whole quality deer management movement has really been born out of protecting yearling bucks, letting them get at least 1 year older and making sure you harvest the appropriate number of does. And that is well reflected in the data, looking at what people are shooting each year, especially from a yearling buck percentage, because, back in the late 80s, early 90s, 8 or 9 out of every 10 bucks shot were only 1.5 years old. And we have followed that since 1989 all the way to now. And it's really bottomed out the last few years right at about a third of all the bucks are only 1.5. So what that means is it's a very different standing crop of deer, which ultimately means it provides a very different hunting experience for most hunters today. That's pretty exciting.
Gotcha. You also mentioned that the antlerless harvest has now declined 19% in the past decade. That's a big statement right there, because you're not even talking about antlered deer. You're just talking about antlerless. It seems like there's a lot that would go into that stat.
Yeah, and that is huge. And you know what? And most hunters that's completely foreign to them. Partly because hunters really pay attention to what's going on with the number of bucks that are killed, and not so much the number of antlerless deer. So monitoring that, I mean, that is a huge drop over that time period. And part of that is more wildlife agencies today have a really good handle on where their deer herds are. So they're not trying to reduce them as aggressively as they were 5 or 10 years ago. So some of that is by design, where they just don't issue as many antlerless tags or as many either sex days to harvest antlerless deer. So it has to come down some. But part of that is not by design. Part of that is by a function of really reduced fawn recruitment rates because of predation, because of disease, and other things. Most deer herds today just simply aren't nearly as productive as they were a decade or two ago. So they're not pumping as many fawns out into the system, and certainly not as many fawns are surviving. So there are some places that are shooting fewer deer today, and that's a good thing. There are others that are shooting fewer deer today simply because they don't have anywhere near the number of deer they used to have to shoot, and that's very concerning.
Gotcha. The last thing that I want to highlight before we move out of the introduction is you talk about CWD, and that, I think, seems like every week my news guy, Jim, out of Michigan, comes up with a new CWD article that's written. This is a huge deal, and it's something that is on the forefront of all deer hunters across America, and especially deer biologists. What are some of the trends we're seeing there, just in synopsis?
Yeah, you know what? I'm an optimist, and there's a lot of good things going on in the deer world right now. But man, this is one thing that is really, really bad. Half of the states in the U.S. now have confirmed CWD, and the list continues to grow. New research shows that deer that have CWD die at 3 to 4 times the rate of deer that don't have it. So CWD is 100% fatal. Every deer is going to die from it, but they can live a while before they do, which gives us a chance to study them. But the fact that they die at 3 to 4 times the rate from things like predation, disease, hit by car is not a good thing. And essentially what's happening, Jay, is our deer herds in many places are disappearing right under our noses. And in many cases, hunters are completely blind to it. We don't realize it because deer can carry the disease for a long time before they show any symptoms. And because of that, hunters don't see sick deer very often or almost never. So they don't realize that it is a problem. But it is by far the biggest issue that hunters right now are dealing with and will be dealing with for the foreseeable future.
Gotcha. So the part 1 talks about deer harvest trends, and to study a trend, you have to have multiple data sets in multiple years, right? So in this particular book, the 2018 report, you're studying 3 different years. You're studying the 2014, 2015, 2016 as the trends, and it doesn't cover 17 and obviously not 18. Before we get into the stats, you did have some interesting studies, and these are just some highlights from the 17-18 season. You said at the time this was written, there were some interesting points you made out about the harvest in both Illinois, Missouri, New Hampshire, New York, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. Can you make some comments on those?
Sure. Our 2018 report, or every report that we have, comes out in January, which means our 2018 report came out in January of 2018, which means almost every state's 2017 hunting season was still going. So when our report comes out, we use the most recent data that is available, and that is from the year prior to that, from the deer harvest end. So that's why the 18 report, the most recent season, is the 2016/17 season. Okay. However, people want to know, hey, what's going on right now? Because in many states, the bulk of their hunting is done for that year. So we always include just a little outlook for the next year based on news reports and what we see from press releases. And so what that showed is that, boy, in many states, this past hunting season was a pretty good one for folks. Deer harvests were up in many places, which is a good thing. Hunters certainly like that. That's a good thing for the agencies. So we at least try to forecast a little bit what folks can expect to see in next year's report.
Gotcha. You did mention in this report that the harvest was up in Illinois, or slightly up. It was significantly more up in Missouri, up 15% in New Hampshire. Southern zone in New York was up 13%. Tennessee had a deer harvest lowest numbers in 10 years, which is kind of the opposite of the first four. Wisconsin had harvest numbers down slightly. And talking about those numbers, I had an opportunity to have a good ice fishing day in New Hampshire over the winter with a biologist for the state of New Hampshire, one of the positions that you formerly occupied. And he told me that the kills of mature bucks was the largest on record for the state of New Hampshire this past season. Do you have any of that data in front of you?
I knew that was up good, and part of that was, so much of in that part of the world, winter kill plays in big time on what happens in the future. So, they had a great crop of fawns make it into that yearling age class a couple of years ago, and is now, really providing a bunch more opportunities for hunters. So I think that's what played in a lot into that New Hampshire statistic,
okay.
which I certainly remember those days where, man, you have a bad winter and then, your deer herds suffer for the next several years because of it. So it's nice for the agency's deer biologist when you get a nice winter and a whole bunch of fawns survive, and makes real happy hunters for the next few years.
Gotcha. So that good winter you had a few years ago, now you'll see your mature bucks coming out of that crop.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
That makes sense.
So, in many states we're like that this year. The statistic you mentioned about Tennessee being way down, that was really driven by, they were hit hard by hemorrhagic disease last year.
Okay.
And so there was just a lot of deer they lost, and a lot fewer animals on the landscape. And man, their harvest really showed it.
You break down some of the deer harvest data in the report for years 2014, 2015, 2016, and you break it down into Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, West, and Canada as your regions for the QDMA that you're studying. Let's get into the top 5 states antlered buck harvest.
When we did that, we followed what the state wildlife agencies do for the most part on how they divide their regions into their different regional meetings. For instance, every year there's the Northeast Deer Technical Committee meeting with the lead deer biologist from all of those states in the Northeast that we have highlighted in this. The Midwest Deer Study Group meeting includes the agencies that we used in the Midwest. Some of them overlap a little bit, but originally that's how we broke that out, trying to then be most consistent with how we're reporting data among those regions, and then for ease of use for those state wildlife agencies as well.
Okay.
So that's kind of how that whole dividing line got put in there.
Okay. And you described or defined antlered bucks as 1.5 years old or older. That's
correct. Yep. Any buck that has antlers that in a state, you would have to use your buck tag on, or your antlered deer tag.
Okay. All right. So looking at the 2016 harvest, top 5 states, Texas was the number 1, it looks like, for overall antler buck harvest. Yep,
that's correct. And, and Texas always leads that, partly because, Texas is by far bigger than all the other whitetail states, a lot of hunters. So what we do in this report is, we pull out the top 5s for a lot of different statistics, just because it's cool to look at and hunters like to see. And as soon as we do that, we realize, well, that's not really a fair comparison to talk about how, say, Rhode Island compares or some other small state. So for a lot of those statistics like that, we see who kills the most, but then we also take a look at it on who shot the most on a per square mile basis, because that gives us a little more apples to apples comparison, a much more realistic way to talk about who truly is shooting the most deer on the landscape when you start looking at it, from an area perspective.
Gotcha. All right. So if you look at it from just pure buck numbers, Texas, 300 in 2016, 399,487. The next closest state was Michigan at 196,233. But if you break it down per square mile of pure land that is associated with the state, Michigan is at the top with 3.5 per square mile.
Yeah, and in the way that we actually come out with those square mile estimates, and we get calls every year on this saying, hey, what actual acreage do you include in those? And so one year we actually asked all the state wildlife agencies, hey, how do you figure your deer habitat? And man, some included ag fields, some did not include ag fields, some included forests, some did a different way. So we said, this isn't going to work. So what we do for this is we actually take the total area of every state and subtract out the water bodies. So some states that are extremely urbanized probably are, a little, they don't get as fair of a shake at this as others because it's just total area minus water. But at least that's the simplest way that we can be consistent, across states and across years. And what's most important is to be able to look at how those numbers change over time anyway. So since we could never get a true deer habitat measure from each state, the way that we chose to do it, we figure is probably the safest and the fairest. So that's what we use and go with. And the fact that Michigan shakes out at, shooting 3.5 bucks per square mile, that is an astronomical harvest rate. Hunters in Michigan shoot a pile of bucks. So that's extremely high harvest for sure.
Seems high. I mean, I wouldn't know because I live in New Hampshire, of course. But so Michigan at 3.5, you've got Pennsylvania at 3.3, and South Carolina tied with that. And these are, I guess these are some of the things I don't really think about until I started reading this book. Maryland 3.1 and Wisconsin at 2.9. So those are your top per square mile harvest states based off of 2016. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and actually, if you take a look at total harvest, if you throw the antlerless deer in there as well, year in and year out, Maryland hunters shoot more deer per square mile than any state in the country. And it's always just under 9. So, they're killing almost 9 deer per square mile. And when I talk about this, I often tell people, say, look, that's how many they shoot. Think of how many are still on the landscape for them to do that annually. And you can take New Hampshire. There are literally places in New Hampshire, where you only have, 10 or 12 deer per square mile standing crop.
Right.
So, so in those cases, you're probably only harvesting, 1 or 2 deer per square mile in many cases. Right. So the fact that these states killed that many, man, there's a lot of venison going in the freezer in a lot of states.
Yeah, and I do hunt Maryland, and I have to say that, sure, they're killing a lot of deer, but the number of deer that I see down there in a day usually is more than I'll see in a season in New Hampshire. Right?
No, I vividly remember many days hunting in New Hampshire, and you're right. See more in Maryland or Pennsylvania or many other states in a day than you will in a season or 5 seasons in some cases in New Hampshire.
Okay, so you're following trends here, and one of the next interesting stat that I see here is top 5 states with greatest antlered buck harvest 2016 versus the 5-year average.
Yep, and we like to take a look at, kind of what's going on now, but then also give readers a snapshot and just, okay, what does this really mean? Because, if I tell you, Texas hunters shot almost 400,000 bucks, yeah, that sounds like a lot, but it doesn't really, you have no reference point for that, so it doesn't really mean anything. So the statistic that you just mentioned, okay, here's what they shot this year, but hey, let's take a look at how this compared to what they had 5 years ago. And so if you can start looking at that over time to understand, okay, is 400,000 a lot or, not many? Well, if you're not from Texas, you probably have no idea.
Right.
So, but it's pretty cool that you think that, what they shot last year, was almost a third more than they have in an average year over the past 5 years. So suddenly that becomes really, really meaningful. And you can realize, wow, they had a huge harvest and, a huge harvest even for them.
See, that is interesting because you wouldn't have a perspective, and perspective is important. Texas was, yes, they had the largest kill, but not the largest per square mile. However, it was a 28% jump over compared to the 5-year average, followed by Vermont at 23%. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey following up with 18, 15, and 14% increase versus the 5-year average for that 1 year. Fascinating. Now, look at the opposite side of that scale. You have the top 6 states with the greatest antlered buck harvest decrease 2016 versus the 5-year average. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, these hunters in these states are ones that tend to be a little bit upset with what's going on. And obviously, there are certain things that can happen in any given state to create a great or a poor year. Winter weather, disease, great mass crop, poor mass crop. So it's important to take a look at any of the states that make these top 5 lists like this and then try to understand what factors go into it. So, in Florida, unfortunately, they shot 22% fewer bucks last year than their 5-year average. So certainly a lot of hunters there saying, holy smokes, anything that you drop over 20%, that's a big difference. So, that Florida has a great management program, lots of really good deer hunting in Florida. So I fully expect that to rebound, or probably did this past year, and hunters to do a lot better in the upcoming season as well. But they certainly will remember that last year or 2 years ago now, they had a pretty poor buck harvest.
What's the factor going in? Why does that happen? Why did it happen?
I am not sure with everything that plays into that number with Florida, why that did drop. I do know that they had changed some of their buck harvest regulations. So there were places there where hunters just simply couldn't shoot as many bucks as they could in the past. Florida is the only state in the country that does not have a buck bag limit. So you can, like in Pennsylvania, you can kill 1 buck a year. That's it. In many states, you can shoot 1 or 2 or maybe 3 bucks a year. Florida had no limit. So folks could literally shoot a buck a day for a lot of the season. And now they have some regulations in parts of their state that hunters just simply can't do that anymore. So I suspect that as much as anything played into this big decrease, which was by design from the State Wildlife Agency.
Gotcha. You can get all the states about the estimated buck harvest and the percent versus the 5-year average. Every single state is broken down, but those are the highlights. Let's take a little coffee break, and when we come back, we'll pick up where we left off and talk more about deer harvest trends with QDMA's Director of Conservation, Kip Adams. How many of you have eaten a vine-ripened, juicy tomato picked fresh from the garden? How does that compare to the bland, pale, hard tomatoes that you've seen at the grocery store during the winter? No comparison, right? Well, if the coffee that you typically drink comes from a can or whatever was on sale that week, you owe it to yourself to give Hunter's Blend a try. Just like store-bought tomatoes don't hold a candle to the fresh ones from your garden, store-bought coffee doesn't hold a candle to select specialty-grown, fresh roasted coffee. Store-bought coffee, and most coffee for that matter, comes from cheap, inferior-grade coffee beans because they're cheaper. Farmers in Nicaragua and Thailand select their top beans, which are then purchased direct by the folks at Hunter's Blend Coffee, where they custom roast beans in their Central Ohio roastery to produce a premium-grade coffee. Just like that first bite of a ripe, juicy tomato, one sip of fresh brewed Hunter's Blend coffee is all that it will take for you to realize that you've never really had coffee until now. Go to huntersblendcoffee.com to order some today. And as always, let your local hunting store know about Hunter's Blend Coffee so they can carry it in their store. Hunter's Blend Coffee. We're hunters too. And now back to our conversation with Kip Adams, Director of Conservation at the QDMA. All right, let's move on to deer harvest trends, the percent of buck harvest by age class. Now, this is pretty interesting. You talk about the same kind of thing. You're looking at top 5 states with the lowest percentage of yearling bucks in a buck harvest, 2016. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, this is really interesting because some states either have antler restrictions or it's just a cultural shift where hunters just simply don't shoot yearling bucks anymore, even if they are eligible, because they want the opportunity to hunt older bucks. And there's a handful of states, and every year the ones on this top 5 list, usually at least 4 of these 5 make the top 5 list. Where they just harvest a very, very low percentage of yearling bucks. So, for example, in Arkansas, only 5% of all the antlered bucks they shot were 1.5 years old. So 95% of their buck harvest was 2.5 or older. And they also do a great job, moving deer into the 3 or 4 year old age class. So, you can think about how differently that hunting season is from some other state that harvests, a high percentage of yearling bucks. So very different opportunities for hunters in those 2 scenarios, and very different expectations for what they may see opening day.
Gotcha. So if you were looking at this as a hunter, you're saying, okay, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Florida, even though it's down in Florida, 22%, that in 2016, those percentages were the lowest overall of the yearling buck harvest compared to, or the lowest percentage of the yearling bucks in buck harvested that year. Now, you take a look at, and I think that's more or less pro QDMA, right? That's what QDMA's results are. That's what you're hoping for, I think, more so than a lot of other things. But
that's correct. Yep.
So
that's right.
Then you turn to the top 6 states with the highest percentage of yearling bucks taken. Now, this is the one that always shows up in like social media as, okay, these are the worst deer management states in the nation, in a sense. And I'm not saying that this is bad necessarily, but compared to the other ones, these are the top 6 states that kill more yearling bucks than any other.
Yeah, and this one, this always gets a lot of attention for sure. And there's a couple things about this graph. One is that, Wisconsin is significantly higher than everybody else. So I think it's pretty interesting that there's only 2 states, even on this table, that over half of their bucks that they shoot are 1.5. So even the other ones, there's 4 states on this chart, Michigan and Maryland and Virginia and New York, that over half of their buck harvests are at least 2.5 years old. So it's amazing how much this table has changed over the years. Historically, all of the states on it would be way over 50%, 60 or 70%. So that's not the case anymore. So even though states, often don't want to be on this one, even the ones that are, or for most part anyway, are doing a really good job. New Hampshire kind of gets caught in this as, they're the second highest percentage of yearling bucks of any state in the country. New Hampshire's a bit different though, because of what we mentioned a bit earlier with the winter kill versus a good fawn crop. So and that part of the whitetails range, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, to a lesser extent Massachusetts, that winter just drives so much of what they have. So when you have an easy winter, you get this huge flush of fawns that make it into the yearling age class, and then because of that, you get years like this one. That's why New Hampshire's on there now, where they killed a bunch of yearling bucks. And in many places, that wouldn't necessarily be a good thing. But in New Hampshire's case, it shows a great thing in that they had a huge flush of bucks, out there on the landscape. Right. So at 51%, a lot of states would look at that and say, oh, man, this is not good. New Hampshire's looking at it and going, man, we had a great reproductive year, and our deer herd's pretty healthy because of it.
What's fascinating to me about that stat, especially in Wisconsin, at 65% yearling bucks taken in 2016, is that you think of Wisconsin as one of the big buck states historically, right?
You're right. No, and actually, I asked Wisconsin DNR's chief of wildlife about that, and he couldn't exactly put his finger on it either. They certainly kill a pile of big bucks in Wisconsin, but they've been on top of this list for the last few years, and the percentage of yearling bucks is actually growing. So whether that is disease related, where they are so infested with CWD now that at the places that bucks just simply aren't getting into those older age classes now. That's certainly a possibility. They have some of their areas where over half of their adult bucks have CWD. So, all those deer are dying. I don't know exactly all the reasons for this, but Wisconsin kills some big bucks, no doubt. But they've been leading the country in the statistic now for a few years running.
Okay. Now, this next stat is pretty interesting. Top 5 states with highest percentage of 3.5-year-old bucks in the buck harvest data. Now, if you're a big buck hunter, you're kind of like keyed in on this a little bit. Right? This is the one. Okay, where am I going to go where I have the best shot at shooting a 3.5-year-old overall? Now, the number one in this list is Mississippi at 78%. That's a lot.
That is a lot. And this is a list that the hunters gravitate to because they want to see, all right, where are the highest percentage of these older bucks coming from? And we get a lot of criticism as well from folks saying there's no way that's true, or, that's not true. How do you know that number's right? And we tell people, it's like, we're not the data police. We ask the state wildlife agencies, just give us the best data that you have. And so they do. So, we're just reporting data that's given to us. One thing, though, with Mississippi, I am very keen on that, though, because I've presented various versions of this report over the years at national conferences. And so I've talked with the folks at Mississippi to make sure that I understood where their data did come from. And they often get criticized as that being just the cream of the crop, private land areas that they have. But what the folks from the state of Mississippi say is that data comes from, they take certainly their deer management assistance program, which is kind of the better private lands. They take the harvest data from that and the harvest data from all of their state wildlife management areas. So all the public lands. So they said, kind of the best age structures we have and the worst age structures we have, all that data goes together for the number that they report to us. So they stand firm that is a very accurate representation of what their buck harvest is across the state, and defend that to the end. So if they collect a tremendous amount of data. So if it's good enough for them, it's certainly good enough for us. And it is amazing to think that hunters there do that good of getting deer into the 3-year-old or older age class. And wow, there's a lot of hunters there reaping the benefits from it.
Gotcha. All right. So, and again, let's reverse this. Top 5 states with the lowest percentage of 3.5-year-old bucks. So this is where I would think as hunters, you may not decide to go hunt here. And this is, again, based off of 2016, not 2017. Number 1, Tennessee. 16% of the buck harvests were 3.5 plus bucks, 3.5-year-old plus bucks. What does that mean?
And it's basically just a reflection of how good states do of protecting yearling bucks. So most states that kill a high percentage of yearling bucks, then they just don't have any that make it into that 3 and older age class. So Tennessee ends up, they do a fair job protecting yearlings, but they kill a lot of their deer at 2.5, which there's certainly nothing wrong with that at all. But they just don't get many deer into that 3.5-year-old and older age class. So that's how they ended up on this list.
And
so it's almost a reverse image of the percentage of yearlings in the harvest.
Exactly. So in this list, Tennessee came in the top ranked at 16% and tied with Wisconsin. New York at 19%, Vermont at 20%, and then New Hampshire at 24%. So looking at this, you can get a picture of where the bigger bucks are being shot. More mature bucks. It's not the most, but it's more mature in the age class. And there's one other stat in here that I think is very interesting, is that, yes, you look at these individual stats from 2016 state by state, but if you look at since 1989, the percent of yearling bucks in the U.S. has dropped dramatically, 1989 to 2016. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it dropped every single year from 1989 through 2014. And then has really leveled out for the last 3 hunting seasons. And that is in large part through efforts from QDMA to just teach people the benefit of protecting yearling bucks, both to the deer herd and, to their hunting opportunities. So that more than anything else is what has played into that, 2-decade run of every year shooting fewer and fewer yearlings. Hunters were just having the opportunity to shoot more bucks that were at least 2.5 years old. And boy, as soon as they started doing that, they realized, ooh, this is way better than shooting yearling bucks. So as a general rule, there's been a whole cultural shift in hunters across the whitetails range to protect yearling bucks, even if they're allowed for or eligible for harvest in their area. There's I think 23 states now have antler restrictions designed to protect those yearling bucks. But even in many states that don't have antler restrictions, hunters are just willingly passing them. So you end up with a graph like this where 2/3 of the bucks shot today are at least 2.5 years old. So it's pretty exciting for hunters.
Right. Gotcha. All right. Let's move on to the antlerless deer harvest. I mean, clearly this is the QDMA report. This is not the big buck report. So you guys will look at all stats and you compile it. So I think that's very interesting. Let's break that down a little bit. So the top 5 states antlerless harvest.
Yeah, and just like for the buck side, Texas typically leads this for many of the same reasons. Lots of deer, lots of hunters, and big area. So we make sure that we put on there who shoots the most, because it's just interesting to see, what states are actually killing the most. But then make sure that we also include, all right, let's look at this harvest on a per square mile basis so we can start doing some pretty fair comparisons.
And then you look at the top 5 states, or in top 5 states antler total numbers: Texas, Alabama, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin. Then you get into, like you did with the antler deer, you look at the top 5 states antlerless harvest per square mile. So that takes the land into account, the total acreage that you could find, or total miles that you would find in those states. Now, we had mentioned Maryland in a previous stat with antlered bucks, right? And looks like they're coming in pretty high here again, and they're leading the way in antlerless harvest at 5.7.
Yeah, and actually Maryland and Pennsylvania are the only 2 states that make the top 5 list of bucks harvest per square mile and antlerless deer harvested per square mile. So they're in a real sweet spot of the country with regard to deer habitat. a lot of hunters per square mile, so lots of opportunities. And Maryland and Pennsylvania hunters, lots and lots of venison going in the freezer for sure.
I was going to say, there's a lot of venison if you look at Maryland, Pennsylvania, but a lot of venison top to bottom. Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Alabama. Does being or antlerless, I should say, being harvested. Okay, top states with lowest antlerless harvest. Number 1 is Maine at 0.2, followed by North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, New Hampshire, and Oklahoma. Why are these so low?
Yeah, in most part because these states can have very successful deer management programs without having to shoot a lot of antlerless deer. And particularly taking a look at Maine and New Hampshire, you're at the northern limit of whitetail's range. Winter severity can kill a lot of deer. Productivity is just not as high. The Dakotas, same thing with them. So most of the states on this list, it's not that they're doing a poor job by any means. It's just the dynamics of their deer herds. They're just not as productive as many other places are. So because of that, they don't need to shoot as many antlerless deer to be successful. So they don't, either by design with just not allowing that many tags or whatever the case may be. But if the states on this list harvested antlerless deer anywhere near the rates of Maryland or New Jersey or Pennsylvania, you drive a deer herd into extinction real quickly.
Now, the next stat that you compiled as a highlight is top states antlerless deer per antlered buck harvest. What does this mean to a biologist?
It just gives you an idea of, in most cases, you need to shoot more antlerless deer than antlered buck deer to have a successful deer management program. Not everywhere, but in many places. So you can take a look at, all right, in any given state, how many antlerless deer are they shooting per buck? Is it about equal? Is it near 1-to-1? Are they shooting more bucks than does, or are they shooting more does than bucks? And so it just gives you an idea of it, the ratio of antlerless deer to bucks in the harvest. So if you know that, and you know what part of the country the state's from, you can get a pretty good idea of how successful they're being at balancing deer herds with a habitat and likely having pretty balanced, healthy age structures.
Okay. So if you look at that, Delaware at 2.1 to 1, and then following down, Alabama, it's about a 2-to-1 ratio. Maryland, about a 2-to-1 ratio. New Jersey, 1.5 to 1. Georgia, Mississippi, almost 1.5 to 1. All right, let's move on to, and I'm fascinated that you were able to do this. You look at the percentage of antlerless harvest by age class. So you're actually looking at age class of antlerless deer. That's got to be a lot of extra work.
Yeah, and kudos to the state wildlife agencies for collecting this information. And not all of them do, but the vast majority of them do. So, and this is what they get through, at biocheck stations and where they will go to meat lockers and taxidermists and all different kinds of places to actually get their hands on the jawbones for the deer that the hunters are harvesting. And then from that, be able to estimate the age classes of those, which is very helpful for management purposes to understand, do we have complete age structures, or, do we have a very young deer herd or an older deer herd? It's all of that goes into how wildlife agencies manage deer. So it's great data to have. And unfortunately, most state wildlife agencies do a good job collecting it.
Now, what's interesting is that you actually put not just the 1.5-year-old, the 2.5-year-old, and 3.5-year-olds, which are all mature, or not necessarily mature, but older does. But then you have a category of fawns in here. So to me, your fawns, that could be a buck or a doe. That could be your future buck class, right?
Yep, that is correct. And there are certain years during this report that we will actually ask, like what percentage of your antlerless harvest were buck fawns and what percentage were doe fawns. So every year we ask what percentage of the total antlerless harvest just made up of fawns. So it makes it nice just to watch how that number changes over time. Mm-hmm. And boy, some states shoot very, very few fawns. Others, and it tends to be the ones that are a lot more productive, where they're just pumping a lot more fawns into the system. Some of those states shoot a lot of fawns each year. So it's pretty cool just to see how different states, or how that percentage of fawns in harvest can be so different in different states based on where they are in the whitetails range and productivity of the habitat and of the management programs. So fortunately, it's not a one-size-fits-all recipe. It's nice that we can do things differently depending on the environment where those deer are living to help be successful.
I guess I'm kind of shocked that and this is percentage of antlers harvest by age class. The that there are any states that actually track the fawn shooting, or that even that there's fawns being taken. I mean, that kind of blows my mind when I didn't know that. But if you look at top states with the lowest percentage of fawns by antlerless harvest, Texas is ranked number 1. They shoot 1%. So Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Kentucky round out the lowest percentage of fawns being taken as part of the antlerless study. Now, reverse that, top 5 states with the highest percentage of fawns being taken through the antlerless. And and this blows my mind, Ohio, 45% of the antlerless are fawns. That seems like an awful lot.
That is a lot, and that's in large part just a reflection of just how healthy Ohio's deer herd is, and just how productive their does are. Just putting so many fawns on the ground and so many into the huntable deer population. That's what that a reflection is of as much as anything. So, but yeah, almost half of all their antlerless harvest are made up of fawns. Certainly much higher than every other state, and. But it stays pretty constant in Ohio, that percentage year after year, which is remarkable, first of all, but secondly, a testament to just how many fawns they actually get on the ground on an annual basis.
Do you ever check in to see how many of those fawns that they're shooting are bucks versus does?
Yeah, we ask that a question every few years, and off the top of my head, I don't know, but I'm sure the Ohio DNR does know. Okay. And every time we ask that, and a few of our annual report or our whitetail reports, and you can look back through and find where we had reported that. So I'm sure they know. I just don't know off the top of my head.
Okay. So Ohio ranks number 1 with 45%, followed by Pennsylvania with 36%, Maryland 35%, Massachusetts 34%, Illinois 32%. Then finally, you wrap up with top 5 states with the highest percentage of 3.5-year-old plus antlerless harvest. Texas ranks number 1, shooting the oldest does with 60%, followed by Mississippi 57%, and these are all north of 50 here: Mississippi, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Fascinating. It's mind-boggling you were able to collect all this stuff.
Yeah, we're very lucky that some states have tremendous programs for collecting data, some a lot more than others, and Texas is one that does collect a lot of data, so we're glad to analyze it and report it.
So, talking about the collection of data, how does that all go about? Can you speak of how some different states go about collecting this data?
Sure. There's a lot of different ways they get it. Some will have wildlife agency staff literally man check stations certain days of the year. So when hunters shoot a deer, they have to take it to the check station so the agency biologist can weigh it and pull the jawbone to be able to age it and take other kinds of data from it, measure antlers, etc. Some of them require you to send a tooth in from the bucks from the deer that you harvest, so that they can age it that way. Some states will go to meat processors or go to taxidermists and take a sample of the deer that are brought to those places. So lots of different ways that the agencies can get the data. Some, just tend to work better in some states than others. So agencies do whatever they can within their budget to be able to get that amount of data. And, almost every state used to have check stations, which made it pretty easy. Check stations are a thing of the past. Unfortunately, most states, don't have the budgets to man them anymore. And most hunting seasons today are so much longer that, it's not like where you used to shoot the majority of the deer on just a handful of days. With longer expanded seasons, the biologists just aren't able to get all that data in a timely manner. So gotcha. While there's fewer and fewer check stations, they're just forced to get them in other places now.
All right. So moving on, you've also broken down the percent of deer harvested by weapons type. And this is kind of cool. I kind of like this one. So you're looking at the total in 2016, the U.S. harvest by weapon, 65% went to firearm, 23% went to bow, 11% went to muzzleloader, and 1% to other. I don't know what the other is, but I guess it doesn't matter. The top states that percentage by bow harvest comes in at 58% New Jersey. Does that surprise you?
Actually, New Jersey leads the statistic every year, and there's a couple things that play into that. One, they have a lot of deer. but mostly because they're the most urbanized state in the country. So because of that, they have a lot of firearm ordinance rules where hunters simply cannot use firearms. They have to use archery equipment. So that's what really drives that percentage so high in New Jersey.
I see that New Jersey is ranked number 1. Connecticut comes in at 50, Ohio at 45, Massachusetts at 42, Illinois, Kansas, Michigan. I see, a few of these states have high firearm regulations on them anyway. New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts kind of stick out. But Michigan, that I don't know if that's surprising to me or not. I mean, they're still in the top 6 here, top 7. Do any of these surprise you being in the top 7?
Not really. They're big archery opportunities, and no, everything there. They're well known as places to either use archery equipment because it's a great state for that, or because of firearm regulations, you're almost forced to use it.
Gotcha. Idaho comes in number 1 at 94%. So you've got a lot of gun hunters in these states. Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, Texas, Maine, and South Carolina. And I can certainly see Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, and Texas. That makes sense. Maine makes sense. South Carolina, I didn't realize that. South Carolina kind of sticks out to me as I would think they would almost be more bow hunting, but they're a rifle state or a gun state.
Yeah, and part of that is they have the longest rifle season in the country. Yeah, they start shooting deer with rifles in August, and it runs through the end of January, and very liberal bag limits. So lots of opportunity to shoot a lot of deer and a long time to do it. Right. It's kind of how South Carolina ends up on that list.
South Carolina was at the bottom, but they're not 89% harvest by rifle or shotgun, all the way up to Idaho at 94, and everybody else in between Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Texas, Maine. Fascinating. Now, to wrap this section up, you're looking at top states by muzzleloader. I did not see this coming. Rhode Island at 45%. Crazy.
Mm-hmm. That is a bunch. And I think that's a lot by just opportunity, kind of like archery opportunity in New Jersey is so high. And there's tremendous opportunity in Rhode Island with muzzleloaders. And Rhode Island often leads this list as well on an annual basis. So, a lot of deer in Rhode Island getting shot by muzzleloaders each year. And that's a year in, year out thing. So.
Okay. But there's a big jump between number 1 and number 2. Virginia at 27%, followed by New Hampshire, and the rest of them are pretty much in the 20s. Virginia, New Hampshire, Tennessee, Massachusetts, and Vermont, all between 22 and 27%. But that's a big difference between 27% and number 2 in Virginia versus the 45 in Rhode Island. What is it in Rhode Island that's so much different? Is it just...
I think that's harvest firearm restrictions as well, where the best opportunity to shoot a lot of their antlerless deer is with a muzzleloader, where you can't use a shotgun or can't use a rifle. So there's just a lot of hunters that, because of that, choose to go ahead and use that muzzleloader. So and that's how they fill their deer tag because of it, which is then just drives the percentage of total deer shot with a muzzleloader real high in Rhode Island.
Gotcha. Kip, I appreciate you coming on. We covered part 1 of all the harvest trends that are going on in the United States and through the QDMA tally of all this stuff. Let's get together again. Let's cover part 2, current trends and issues, because this goes even deeper into some of the more non-statistical data that you're looking at, or some of the opinions, anywhere from legality of crossbows, legality of cell camera usage, legality of drone hunting. So and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of stuff we need to cover. So if it's okay, I'd like to have you come back on maybe in part 2. We'll do that next week, and we'll talk about current trends and issues based off of your 2018 Whitetail report that you put out through the QDMA.
All right. I think that sounds great. Yeah, let's do that.
Awesome, Kip. So if we haven't answered enough questions, or if we've created more questions than answers as part of our conversation, where can people reach out to you to get more information and to get a hold of this booklet?
They can get this booklet. It's a free download off our website, which is QDMA.com. While they're there, they can grab any of the other reports as well. Those are all there for a free download. If they wanted to reach out to me directly, my email is kadams, it's KADAMS @QDMA.com, or my office number is 814-326-4023. I'm happy to answer any questions about the report or anything else deer or habitat related, and help them out however I can.
Awesome. Well, Kip, thank you so much for coming on the show, and we'll pick this up again next week. And thanks for coming into Big Buck Registry Studios.
All right. That sounds great. Thank you.
Well, that was just a plethora of statistics. That's how it all stacks up, state to state, wherever you are. Now you know. And you can get this exact report online at QDMA.com. And there's so much data in this, but it's a fascinating read if you like deer stats. And Kip will be back next week to pick up where we left off. And we're going to talk about more current issues and trends about deer and deer hunting, and all the legality things that are coming up, whether it be trail camera legality or drone legality or CWD, lots of different things like that. And we're going to talk about the QDMA mission and their annual report. So stay tuned for that. Dusty, do we have a Chubby Tines tip of the week?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the whitetail deer and what's going on in the woods right now. I know a lot of people's focused on turkey hunting.
The Chubby Tines tip of the week is sponsored by Morse's Sporting Goods. Firearms, used firearms, bows, used bows, located at 85 Kentucky Falls Road in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. Give Jim a call at 603-464-3444, morsessportinggoods.com. Your dollars go further in New Hampshire. There's no sales tax. Morse's Sporting Goods.
But if you get that particular buck that you want full season from the beginning stages of the velvet all the way through to the hard antler, and hopefully you get a shot at him this fall, right now is a great time to get them trail cameras out and get them hung up and start getting some pictures or take some video. And it's that time of year, and start putting your minerals out and get the deer herd and the health going. And it's just that time, Jay.
Very cool. I agree with you. I think getting some cameras out would be a great idea right now. Dusty, where can we find you when you're not hanging out here in the studios with me?
Shoot me an email, dusty@bigbuckregistry.com. You can look me up on Instagram and Twitter @ChasingAntler, Facebook.com/Chubby Tines Outdoors. Jay, where can the people reach out to you when you're not on the mic?
Likewise, you can shoot me an email, jay@bigbuckregistry.com, and you can visit us on Facebook, facebook.com/bigbuckregistry. We're also on Twitter, which is twitter.com/bigbuckregistry. We're also on Instagram, instagram.com/bigbuckregistry, and YouTube, which is youtube.com/bigbuckregistry. On YouTube, you can listen to all of our podcasts in their entirety. As far as videos are concerned, it's a boring video, but the audio content is there, so you can actually listen to our podcast. You can also listen to all of our live shows that we've done on Thursday nights when we do them, and we've gone back and re-interviewed a lot of our previous guests we had on the show just to put a face to a voice, let's put it that way. You can always listen to our show on other places as well, not just YouTube. We're found on Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and as an Amazon Alexa skill. Go to Alexa and say, Alexa, enable Big Buck Registry. And if you would like to submit a buck to our page for consideration and be featured on our page in front of 250,000 diehard deer hunting fans, all you have to do is go to bigbuckregistry.com/mybuck, and all of the instructions will be right there. I think that's pretty much everywhere we're at. I think that's a wrap, Dusty.
That's a whole lot of big buck, Jay.
Sure is. I'm Jay Scott.
I'm Dusty Phillips.
And this is the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. We'll see you next week.